Our speaker today is Sharron H. And Sharron Heiberger has 17 years of experience in your hovering. What?
I'm sure everybody wants to know how much money.
Well, I was going to introduce her, but okay, fine. He wants to brag about how much money he stole from all of you. And it came out to $386.50. Robin Hood here. Yeah, thank you. Very, very generous of everyone. No, who did? Ooh, good job. It's because he's foreign. We like accents. Alrighty, I'm going to start again. Our wonderful and talented speaker today is Sharron Heiberger. She has 17 years of experience as a mental health, hospital, and hospice clinical chaplain, and is certified in spiritual direction and grief counseling, volunteering volunteering as such at a woman's state prison. She facilitates a community contemplative prayer group, just as Step 11's prayer and meditation. After her spiritual awakening, she authored Dancing with Depression, a spiritual path for recovery from darkness to light. Sharron offers presentations and workshops affirming the spiritual dimension toward depression and suicide ideation recovery, and is authoring books outlining these spiritual principles. She's been in 12-step Al-Anon for 35 years and EA since 2013. While she achieved academic degrees, she considers all peripheral compared to finding a conscious walk out of depression through a spiritual pathway. Hope for others caught in the quagmire of depression is now her 12th step gratitude gift. Let's welcome Sharron.
Thank you so much. Sorry for the stumbling.
That's all right. That's all right. Lost my podium, so now I have no hands here. Let me start by thanking you for coming. And there is a handout at the end. The yellow one is kind of a summary of the points that I like to leave. So if you are a visual learner, you're going to take notes anyway, but those of you go, oh, I need to remember that, and so you're focusing on that and you don't hear anything else I say. So this will be your kind of your little cheat sheet. The blue one is just a little writing that I had in what I call a, oh, thank you, Cameron. You're a keeper. Thank you. My cord is caught. All right, let's get reorganized here. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, thank you. And the blue one is just something that I wrote in kind of what I call a contemplative moment, which means I'm not really thinking a lot. I'm just kind of letting things flow. I used this as a presentation in June to the Army National Guard, who read my book and approached me. They said, we have veterans committing suicide 22 a day, and why are you alive, and why do you not even have it anymore? What do you know that we don't know? And so that was very gratifying to be able to speak to our veterans, because I have a special place in my heart for them, as all of us do. So I am Sharron, and I am powerless over my emotions. So my back is spasming, my heart is beating. My husband said, well, that's a good thing. I go, why? He said, well, that's because you're connected body, mind, and spirit. And I said, well, that sounds pretty good. So if you'll take just a moment and breathe with me a few seconds so I can kind of orient myself. Thank you. Let me start by saying that I have done some workshops entitled Finding the Sacred in Depression, because that is what happened to me. And in my presentations, I have received comments back from people, and those are floating around in my head today. And so I'm going to begin by getting some of those out of my head. And first of all, I want to say that this is the first time that I've given a talk and felt like I was preaching to the choir. And so that's a little intimidating to me, but I also know that I'm standing here in front of a room of listeners. Listeners are people who know they need to listen to others. And listeners are people that know they need to hear what other people have to say. And listeners are individuals who know we need to change. And so I thank you for being good listeners today, and for coming, and for being interested in hearing what it is I would have to say about this. So first of all, I think about a woman in Texas who told me I told my story of living with depression for over 50 years. It started out as a child. It's probably about 8 or 9 when I had my first loss. I was suicidal at 13. And then again, so that would be, I was born in 48, so that would be in the mid-50s, again in the early 70s, again in the early 80s, again in the early 90s. Obviously, when the millennium turns over, I don't do so well. But when I shared my story, and it to me is the story of grace, because I didn't know 12-step, I didn't know higher power, I didn't know the word depression as a child, I didn't know suicide as a child. But what was this that I was ready to throw myself in front of a bus? And so these are some of the comments that I get when I told people where my higher power had led me and taught me and guided me and gave me a new path and gave me a new way of life. And so when she said, well, you should only read books from this certain religion, I said, thank you for caring, but I'm standing here. And you should not meditate. Thank you for sharing, but I'm standing here. And you should never read anything of other spiritual dimensions. Thank you, but I am standing here. There were so many you shouldn'ts, but it very much surprised me that it didn't matter that I didn't have depression after 50 years, and they were taking issue with the method of getting there. And I still don't really understand that. But I would just like to say that it really didn't matter a lot of the pathway that I took, because I've known of other people who found freedom, thank you dear, freedom from depression, and they read different books and they had different pathways and the way they described their higher power, I'm going, for real? Wow. I mean, a girl told me it was her stove. I go, okay, that works for me. And you know, I learned something for that. Just let it simmer, Sharron, just let it simmer. So we can learn from each other regardless, can't we? We can. So I want to first tell you the things that kept me stuck in depression. The first, I'm just going to read them because I don't want to forget it, and it is in your little pamphlet. I thought I was my mind. I thought I was the depression. I believed depression's voice. Even though I had a very good social worker, she could not do affirmations or cognitive behavior therapy with me, which really works well. I didn't believe it. If I made up something in my head that was an affirmation, I completely dismissed it because I had created it. So I am an individual who needed the experience of a higher power. And when I had the experience, then I could affirm the experience. But I was so not trusting of what came out of my head that I dismissed it if it didn't come out of there. So I've learned to shift out of my head and shift into my center. So that's kind of a little background there why I couldn't do the affirmations. I thought I was totally dependent on other people to manage my depression. I had a great psychotherapist. I had a great psychiatrist to do meds. I had 12 steps. I mean, I had everything, but it was all outside of myself. It was all outside of myself. Things that were out there that I could utilize in here. I didn't realize that I gave responsibility to all of those things outside of myself. So that was one of the things that kept me stuck. I believe that there was no person that I could talk to. I really, in my years of recovery, actual recovery from depression, I didn't know anybody else that was in depression. And all the years that I was in a recovery, there was something inside of me that said, I think there's a spiritual dimension to this, but I could not find anybody or anything. Now I'm in Al-Anon at this time. And why did Al-Anon not touch some of this for me? It was because I was married then to an adult child of an alcoholic. So it was never a good marriage. I then realized that both my parents were adult children of alcoholics. Both my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, both my granddads had problems with the bottle, but my one grandpa only drank medicinally, so that kept me very other-oriented and relational-oriented. And so that was okay for what that purpose was, but it never addressed what was a vacancy inside of myself, okay? And then the other thing that kept me stuck is that I thought going to church and practicing my faith at the time was sufficient, and it was not. Just a little bit of history. I don't have to tell you guys a lot about depression, but one thing that is very important to me, there are two things that I was reluctant to say today, but I wanted to say today. So I want to thank my higher power that no one here knew those little things that were stumbling blocks to me. This is what I want to say, but I don't know if it would be well received, and part of that is from kind of the flack that I have gotten from people, but I still get up here. But I want to thank my higher power for working through Susan and Paul twice, a Paul from my home group, and a John from my friend. My husband met a friend, he used to come to Minneapolis. He was supposed to be going to school, but he was fishing most of the time. But those things were addressed for me because my higher power knew that those were stirring around inside of me. So I just want to thank you guys for being open. But when the very first thing that stopped me, I was 12. I was the oldest of 6 siblings. I had a mother that I knew at a very early age was not going to be able to take care of us kids. And so as the oldest, I assumed the responsibility. So by 12, I was pretty burned out. By around 13 or 14, I had made a plan to throw myself in front of a bus. It was in the summer because it was very hot. I had planned to stand on the opposite corner so that he wouldn't think to slow the bus down and stop where I was standing. And I was getting ready to catapult myself. Didn't know the word depression, didn't know the word suicide that I remember, didn't know of anybody who'd ever done anything like that before, had no thoughts of the bus driver, had absolutely no consideration of telling somebody else. And when I get into a suicide planning, there is no thought of anybody else. That's a very irrational place, I think, to be. So what I'm talking today about is how I learned to not go there at all. But as I was ready to catapult myself in front of this bus, there was this loud voice. I think it was in my head, and it said, "Go to church." And I staggered back. It was so loud. And I went to church, and I would not know until another 35 years that that was probably my first experience of being led to meditation. So I walked to church. I do not know how long I sat in that church and cried. I went home. Still, it was not the type of environment where you would tell your mother, do you know, I just really about threw myself in front of a bus. I mean, just it's very sad that I wouldn't even think of telling anybody. And I went upstairs on my bed, and I was sitting there, don't know how long I cried, and I heard a voice. And it said, "God loves you." And I remember thinking at that age, well, that's news after I've been in a parochial school all these years. That was kind of sad. And I wrote a story. And that it was just like I had the whole story. I didn't think the story. I didn't plan the story. It just was, the whole entire story was right there in my mind instantaneously, about a little girl who met a friend every day. And the end of that was, and your friend will be with you every day. So that was about 13 years old. I was way into my 30s before I was capable of looking back on that and going, oh my gosh, you had a divine experience. You had a divine intervention. That would be the pattern following me in my suicide planning. It was in the early 70s. I was in a closet with my husband's service revolver above my head, and I had decided that was not the good way to do it. I had 2 kids at home. And as I was going through my mind thinking what I would do, I heard, you could try faith. And I thought, oh, yeah, I could try faith. It completely stopped the ruminations and the looping. Completely stopped it. It was again in, there were ideation all the time. I just thought everybody lived with that. Then it was in the 90s, I was on a ship. Now, in the 80s, when I was in that crisis, I have no memory of that year, but at the end of the year, I remember a distinct sense that I needed to go to work. And it's like, go to work? I can't even get out of bed in the morning to give my kids breakfast. You want me to go to work? But it was there at that job that I felt like I wanted to sit in silence on my Wednesday lunch hours. And it took a number of years for me to see and connect that only by sitting quietly for 1 hour a week, my life was changing. I went back to college. I got called from working full-time to volunteering full-time, for a workaholic to quit work and go volunteer full-time. That's like parting the Red Sea. And let's see what else. I got my call to ministry, going to chaplaincy. I was raised by a religion where women were not in ministry. Here I am. I was like, what is this? This is like far out. So things were going very well at that time when I took this cruise. And this particular cruise, the weather was just like horrendous. People were getting sick, and the winds were blowing, and the waves were 15 feet high, and the boat was really kind of rocking, and I was exhilarated. It was 2, 3 in the morning. I was very happy on this cruise, and ideation began. And I was out there for hours trying to figure out how to climb over the side of the ship. Have any of you been on a cruise? And that railing is what, about 6 feet, 5 feet? You can barely see over it. Anyway, I had just figured out a way where the girders connect from one deck to another, and there were big bolts that were in this girder, and I realized that I could climb that girder and slip over the side. And I was so happy. I was so relieved, and I was going to join the darkness and join those waves, and it was freedom. Finally, I would be free. And so I was moving towards closer to that girder. I heard, you can't do everything, but you can do something. It broke through the looping. It broke through the ruminations. I thought, oh yeah, went to bed and went to sleep. It would be another 2 years, I think, before I was a chaplain in a mental health institution, and they asked me to do a dual diagnosis program for alcohol and drug. I had a 2-year degree in alcohol and drug, and depression. I'm in the DSM-3. I'm reading about depression. I go, I've got every one of those symptoms. Every one. 45 years old, I never knew life without depression. Even when I was in marriage counseling with my previous marriage, they told me I had reactive depression, which meant to me, manage it. you're not managing things very well. It didn't seem to matter. I'd been suicidal a number of times starting in my childhood. So I always thought it was me. I'm the problem. I'm the problem. Anyway, to make a long story short, I went on a medication. It was fine for 7 years. I got a job as a clinical chaplain. I worked a high stress area in ICU, people on life support, end of life support, death, dying, trauma. I mean, the whole thing. I functioned very well. Then the bottom fell out of my medication, and I never restabilized. So from that was like 2000. I was hospitalized then, and this was the turning point. This is where I died, and this is where I came to life again in a new way. I had always had that intervention of a divine thought that stopped my suicide ideation. And if you've ever been there, ever known anybody, you can't stop it. To me, and there's an assist program that describes the going into suicide planning and attempt as like falling off of a waterfall. And then once you take the leap, you're on your way, you're done. And I get that. So when thought freeze. So I'm in the hospital. So I did not get that thought. I'm curled up in the closet in my back room. My husband is like 10 feet away from me. I'd been in the room for a while before he came looking at me, probably because he was getting hungry. Nobody was fixing dinner. And he found me on the floor, and I could not respond. So either I would have a divine thought that would stop the ruminations, or I would go catatonic. I just don't move. And I could not, as much as I love him, I could not respond to him. I couldn't move a muscle. And I pulled a coat down over my head. I heard him call a friend, and I know that she told him to call my daughter. She's a police officer, so she comes in her little police car, in her little police uniform, and she said, "Mom, you know you need help." And I was able to shake my head. So that's how I got hospitalized. On the 4th day of hospitalization, the first 2 I just slept, but on the 4th day, I'm curled up on the floor, trying to figure out how to do myself in on an area that has been well thought of in precautions. And I remember feeling the worst I'd ever felt in my entire life. The black was so black that I realized that there was absolutely nothing on this earth that could save me. No psychiatrist, no therapist, no social worker, no medication. And I had remarried, a good remarriage. Not the love of my husband, not my children, and not my grandchildren. I had absolute no desire to breathe. And I heard, "Look up." I prayed, "Lord, there is nothing in me that wants to take another breath, but I can't stop myself from breathing. If I am to do life, you will have to do life in me." By the time I went home the next day, there was a new thought that went through my head rhythmically. You have to do life differently. You have to do life differently. You have to do life differently. And I did not know what that was. So hospitals being what they are, I'm in that shape on one day and I'm sent home the next. The next thing that happened to me, I would say that was a step 1. Even though I had surrendered probably 100,000 times in my life, I would not know then that would be the deepest surrender I would ever be able to make in my whole entire life that I know of standing here today. I was home a few weeks, and I was walking from one room in the house. I was going through the bedrooms into the bathroom, and I was stopped. I heard, "Do you believe survival of the fittest is natural to mankind?" And I stopped. I said, "Yes." "Do you agree mankind goes to great lengths to survive?" "Yes." Do you believe suicide then is not natural to mankind? Yes. Then to what do you attribute thoughts of suicide? I'd never thought of it before. I had never thought, to what do I attribute thoughts of suicide? They had been so much a part of my life. I would say I was addicted to it like a drug. It was my answer to everything. If I was overwhelmed. Basically, I was just overwhelmed. I think I was still burned out from being 12 years old. Then when I went to work at the hospital, I had no clinical experience, and they put me in ICU. Well, what is that? You know? So I had burned out on that, which was the root. And even at work, I'd say, I was getting written up. I said, I'm not a bad person. I am in burnout. I am in depression. The hospital didn't seem to understand that. So here I am. To what do you attribute thoughts of suicide? And I thought, I don't know. Depression? Darkness? Death? Is it demonic? I don't know. But I do remember thinking, it's not of God. It is not natural. And that was a moment of sanity for me that I had never had since I was a child. The next thing that said, and what do you know? I know the 12 steps. I know the 11th step. And I heard, do that. And something welled up inside of me, and I made a decision. I made a deal. I made a covenant. Call it what you will. And I said, okay, you take care of the depression, and I'll do the 11th step. So I created in that very same bedroom in the corner a chair by the window, and that became my 11th step. And when you create a sacred spot, it's a little hard to go there and think about suicide and killing yourself and, negativity and all that. But when I first started, it was a very powerful, overwhelming tsunami of intention to not live. I wanted to not be here. I had never felt I should be here. I never felt like I belonged. I felt, and in my book that I wrote, I say that all people with depression should earn Academy Awards because we know on the outside exactly how to behave. But on the inside, nobody's home. And it is a void undescribable. And I think that is the despair. From the doctor's talk the other night, I'm just beginning to appreciate that I would call that what happens to me. My depression was so brittle. The longer you don't get treatment, the more often and the longer and the deeper your depression episodes would be. So by the time I was in this, and I didn't get my new doctor until 30 days after the hospitalization, my social worker, she said, this is the only person I would trust to prescribe medications for you. By then I had had 4 different doctors and 7 different combinations of medication. And in all of those, I was still depressed and still suicidal. So kind of something was wrong with that picture. But there was nothing else to do. That is the only thing I knew to do was the medical model and what was presented to us. So here I am with this deal, and what I decided to do was 2 things. That I would do the 11th step, but I had to first study depression. I had to study suicide ideation. I had to study suicide planning. I had to learn to identify it. And I decided to name it as a darkness. I had to resist it. If it was not a God, it was something else. And it was something else that was like opposing forces in me. I don't know if I really wanted to die. I just didn't want to live here the way I was living. I did not want the life that I knew. It's the only one I knew. So there were 2 parts of that then. I would study it, and I would be aware of my thinking. And when it came at me, I would do one of three things. I would first try to think of something else. And if I could not think of something else, I would go sit in my meditation chair. And the meditations that I would do is also sometimes people call it contemplative, or listening, or stilling the mind, or breath awareness. So breath awareness is what I had learned when I was working and would go sit quietly. So I would go and I would sit and focus on my breathing until it passed. And sometimes I had to stay there a long time. And sometimes my husband was off to work. So sometimes I had to go into that same spot a dozen times a day because I so wanted the other. I so wanted the other. And I I did not know how to do life here with it. I just didn't know. So that was what my deal was. And then the other thing that I had to do is I decided that I would tell my husband when I was in ideation. Because if I was in planning, I could not tell him. It was too late. I'd gone too far. So I had to nip it in the bud. I had to know my thoughts. I had to identify my patterns. I had to be self-aware. I had to choose to resist it. And I had to remember that it was not my God. It was not my God. So what he had to do, because, it was kind of scary that, and he said, we married in 98 and this happened in 2000. He said, I thought I understood depression until I lived with it. And that is true. We're helpless and powerless. What about our loved ones? So what we did was we realized he couldn't tell when I was in trouble. And I could not tell him when I was in trouble. So we got a yellow pad and I wrote down, this is when I'm in trouble. And that was his little Bible, I guess. I quit picking up things around the house. My clothes ended up all over the place. The house got cluttered. I'd get very irritable if he would go, so what's for dinner? Because I've got to do everything, and then she'd be going off like some wild woman. So there was a whole yellow sheet of things for him to notice. And I honestly don't know how much he pulled that out, but I do know it was pretty scary when both of us knew that we had no control of it together. We had no control over it. So what was I doing? I was not acting as if I didn't have depression. No, I had to be very aware of depression. I acted as if it was not my problem to solve. There was nothing on this earth that could manage my depression, and that included me. It included doctors, it included medications, it included everything that I had been told, this is what will help you with depression. It was not enough, and it was insufficient. I didn't bring it with me today, but my first EA book is the Black Book. And when I was reviewing it today, I hadn't looked at it for a while because I got the new one. Chapter 4 is my story. And in chapter 4, this German doctor said, psychiatrist isn't enough and medications are insufficient and all of those things. And I said, thank you. Thank you. And so I've tried to get involved in the community, but basically it's pretty much founded on the medical model in our town, maybe because of Miniger's Foundation. But it's kind of the same story there. So that's another story. I don't want to get into that. So what did I do? I want to tell you what my 11th step became. It really was only 3 parts. It was really only 3 parts. I began to read spiritually. Now, I had my Al-Anon books, but I started reading whatever came my way in spirituality. And it was all different religions, it was different faiths, it was different beliefs, and I started gleaning. And I knew I had to renew my mind, I had to think differently. So not only would I read it, then I would reflect on it. Am I doing this? Am I living this? Is this something that I want to do? Is this something I need to do? Those other people need it. I don't think I do, you know. So it was a reading and a reflecting. The other two things I did, and I would take them in different orders: journaling and meditation. If my mind was so active that I could not meditate, now they say, you know, to get a word, I could not get a word. I was so sick and my mind was so active that if I had a word, I would latch onto it and start thinking, and then off I would go. So I did what's called breath meditation. I only focused on my breath coming in and coming out. It would be 2 to 2.5 years before I realized I had meditated so much that just for me to sit in that chair, my body would relax. I had focused on my breath so much that it had created a relaxation response. So I could be in the car driving and I would get an anxiety attack. You are getting ready to have a horrible accident and you are going to kill yourself and you're going to kill a carload of people. And I'd go, just breathe, Sharron, just breathe. And all I had to do was say that, and I was fine. It took years to develop that. So I'm going, and then, so if I could not quiet my mind, I would go to journaling, and I would journal, and I would journal, and I would write and write and write and write and write. Things were coming up from childhood, and I even wrote like a child sometimes. I had to get this stuff out. Then when I think it was, I don't know, there's been so much wisdom. I don't remember if it was Charlie or the doctor. I truly believe to this day, if I did not do meditation and become aware of what was going on inside of me and process that, I would not be standing here today. I just know that. My husband he was downsized a couple years ago. He went into the same problem. And we agree, if we had not gone into prayer and meditation and journaling, I would not have recovered. I would not have moved forward. Would not have dealt with what was on the inside of me. Things could happen then what is called contemplation is to just sit quietly and not think. The little meditation book for EA uses thinking in part of its description of meditation. And so some people think of meditation as thinking about what you're reading. So that's one word. Another way meditation is used is that people don't think. They just quiet the mind. You focus on a word. Phyllis had a great example this morning. That was a great example. But I want to tell you 2 things that happened to me, and I know that there is no way any human being in this world, if I went into the deepest psychotherapy, I do not think these 2 things would have come up. One of them is during a year, I will intentionally go into silence. I have a little vintage camper, and it's so cute. You would be so jealous. But it's one of those little canned hams that's in perfect condition. There's a whole story about it being a God thing, and I love it. Anyway, I take her out to the lake in the spring and in the fall. But in August, this was my first experience too. In 10, I went up to a silent retreat at a monastery in Atchison, Kansas. I didn't know the monastery was there. If I did, I forgot. What are you going to do with a monastery with a whole bunch of nuns? And I had never been on a silent retreat either. So I go on this silent retreat, and I had some marvelous things happen that had also happened to me at home in meditation. My higher power talked to me and wrote things. They came out in prose, and to this day I have a stack about this deep of things that my higher power has said to me, and they healed me. And my spiritual director said, when are you going to publish those? I go, I don't know. They're my soul. And you put things out there and people, I don't know why you showing up. Whatever. Anyway, I'm not ready for that. But I will someday. But anyway, there was this turning point. I was in this was before I went up there. I was in contemplation. I was just sitting there quietly, and I became very aware, very, very aware that I abhorred myself. I abhorred myself. I had no idea that that was in there. And I sat with that feeling until it changed to compassion. And to this day, I do not know who or what it was. I don't know if it was my higher power. I don't know if it was the spirit. I don't know if it was my own soul. I don't know if it was the innate capacity of a human being to know ourselves. And I read just this last week, contemplation is the beholding of the self in the self by the self. And I believe that that was the point of my healing, that I do not believe any human being could have known to the depth of that degree how much I hated myself. I think that's what I was trying to kill, my own thoughts of myself. Another time, this was when I was on the retreat. I was taking a shower, and don't think about that. I was taking a shower, and I heard, "You have a deep hidden grief." And I stopped washing my hair and go, "What? You have a deep hidden grief?" I said, "Well, what is it?" And it said, "You thought you killed Jesus." I just started bawling. I was raised in a parochial school. You killed Jesus. Jesus died for your sins. I wasn't a very bright child. I took things quite literally. And here I would be 65 years old and grieving the truth that I had actually killed Jesus. Okay. So those are the kind of things that happened in contemplation with me just sitting. The turning point for me that not only was that seeing that I had abhorred myself and sat there until I felt compassion for myself, but it was another day when I was looking out the window. It was cold. It was a wintry day in Topeka. The sky was overcast, and I was just looking out there, and I thought, wow, you know, everything is created by the thought of God. And I thought, well, then I'm created by the thought of God. And then I knew in a way that is so deep I cannot use words. I knew that everything God is in the thought of my I am. Everything that God is was in the thought of me. And I think in that moment I met my origin. And it was the doctor the other day that he said, you don't come from your parents, you come through your parents. And that was so filled every part of my being that I thought, oh, I wonder if this will heal my depression. That was December 3rd of 2010. And I never again had another depression episode. And it was only a few weeks before that I was sitting at my computer. I don't even know what I was thinking. I probably got overwhelmed. I think I have shame attacks, but I was overwhelmed. I went down the hall. I got to the dining room, and I was suicidal. I thought I better call Dr. David. I called him. As I'm pulling out of the driveway, heading down the road, I hear, you do not need to leave this world to find the peace that you seek. And I thought, what does that mean? I get to the doctor's office, and he said, okay, what are you not doing that you were doing? I said, meditation. He said, you go home and you do that, and you come back in 2 weeks. It was almost like the voice of God. What do you know to do? 11th step, do that. So all I really need to do is make a conscious contact with God and breathe. Now that's pretty simple for a workaholic that had to run the world and ICU and everything else. Something else that I left out, probably because I was reluctant to say it, but after my prayer in the hospital, where there is nothing in me that wants to take another breath, and if I'm going to do life, you'll have to do life in me, a male nurse came in and I couldn't respond to him. I was catatonic. He sent in a female nurse, and she said, "Did you harm yourself?" I could hear the ambulance, so I think that they thought I had harmed myself. And she took a hold of my hand, and I said, "Will you pray for me?" And I do not think, I do not remember, I did not hear anything from her. But I did hear in here, "You will be delivered." And I remember thinking, from what? I'm curled up on the floor in a bathroom, not wanting to live or breathe, and I can't figure out what I'm supposed to be delivered from. Now, this is scary for me to say these things because these are some spiritual concepts: darkness, deliverance, resistance, turning, conversion, all of these things. But I have come to believe that I had an intuition all of those years that I was sitting doing meditation and journaling, that there was something that needed to happen on a spiritual basis. And even in that time, I was trying support groups. Somebody watching my time, I only have 5 minutes. That I was utilizing support groups in the community. I tried to go to them, but they only were talking about depression and bipolar. My diagnosis finally was, and I self-diagnosed the bipolar too, was depression with the bipolar spectrum with the emphasis on depression. So my depression was so bad, they totally missed all this bipolar stuff that I had been suffering with. Of course, our household did, and I did. I would get stuck in stores. Like, I would go to Hobby Lobby, and I would have all these ideas after ideas after ideas after ideas of things I could make and do and create and quilt and blah, blah, blah. And I would just exhaust myself. And I'd have to call my husband, and I'd say, "I'm stuck in Hobby Lobby. I can't get out. Tell me to come home." He'd say, "Come home." I go, "Okay." And I would go home. So, or I would get lost in a city that I grew up in. I'd lived there all my life, and I would get disoriented, and I wouldn't know where I was. And I'd call him. I'd say, "I don't know where I am. I don't know how to get home." And he said, "Well, describe where you are." So I would describe where I was, and he'd go, "Okay, do this and this and this," and I would be able to go home. So to make a long story short, again, I do not believe I would be standing here today if I had not followed what was set before me, to read what was brought before me. The first thing I read was The Power Now by Eckhart Tolle, and he said, "You are not your mind." And I remember freaking out. I hated my mind. And if you tell me I am not my mind, it was like somebody took an eraser and erased my entire life. That meant that nothing I experienced, nothing I thought, nothing I perceived, nothing I imagined was real. Then who am I? That was very scary. So then my prayer began, "Lord, who do you say that I am?" And answering that question has been my recovery path. So people who tell me I shouldn't read this, I shouldn't do that, you can't hear God. I had a woman say, "Well, you can't heal from depression." I go, "Really?" I did. You can't have mystical experiences. You can't hear God. You can't know God. You're guided to read this, you're guided to read that, you go here, you go there. It was not until I came back from that silent retreat up at the monastery that about 2 weeks after that I felt like writing. And let me say that it was a Dr. Niemeyer that said journaling is as therapeutic as psychotherapy. So I really say, if you are not journaling, journal. Okay, but where was I going with that? Okay, I don't think I'll go there then, since I can't remember what it was. But that basically, that's all I did for 3 years, and that was, I had stopped Al-Anon 2 years before when I was happily married. I didn't need that program anymore. I got rid of that guy. And in those 3 years, I was not in a program, and it would be another 10, it would be another 3 years before I heard of EA. So I want to be very careful that I don't make something brought to me by my God as my God. This book is not my God. My 12-step program is not my God. My meditation is not my God. None of these things are my God. To me, that when I was in chaplaincy, spirituality definition that we use was spirituality is the relationship between something higher than yourself and other. And in my experience of my own soul recovery, I see the false self that chapter 4 of the Black Book talks about. I now recognize I have a higher self and a lower self. I have a true self and a false self. So when it says your spirituality is a relationship with other, I know my other is the conditioned Sharron that was raised by 2 parents that didn't know how to emotionally love and nurture. It was a Sharron that was conditioned by a religion that had more guilt and threat than it had love and acceptance. Okay? So everything had to go. And so 12, nothing of this earth, just like nothing of this earth could save me, nothing of this earth is my higher power. And let me tell you, I never intended to be a chaplain. I never thought it possible to heal from depression. And by gosh, I never thought I'd be standing at a podium at an EA meeting in St. Paul, Minnesota. So, thank you very much for listening. I would like to say that some of the other spiritual things that I have come to appreciate is the value of mindfulness, the value of breath, and the value of meditation, because it was a turning point for me. I was doing meditation on a daily basis for probably a couple years. I would have my morning quiet time, my 11th step, and then I'd get up and go through the day like some wild, crazy woman in depression. And I'm going, Sharron, if you can stop the thinking and not go there in meditation, you can move into your day and not engage the thinking during your day either, girl. And that's when I really began to recover. So now today, some marvelous things have happened, but I have learned to live. I draw mandalas. I don't draw, but mandalas started coming out of meditation 2 years ago. And I have learned from my mandalas that I have a soul. And my soul is more beautiful than what I can think or imagine or see myself to be. And just as that mandala will come symbol at a time, I cannot see, know, or perceive the finished product, that's how I do my days now. Instead of going to bed and it used to be, oh God, your day's over. Oh God, another day tomorrow. Now I look forward to my quiet time. I look forward to the next morning. But there's still a residue of old thinking because I'll wake up and the whole day can be overwhelming. So just like it works if you work it, where there's 2 pages where EA members made up their own slogans, I've got my own now. It's called Lift and Shift. Lift and Shift. So I wake up in the morning, the old thoughts are there. Oh, the whole day is overwhelming. I don't know what to do because I'm a workaholic without a job. And I'll go, okay, what's the seed? What's first? And what's next? And what's next? And what's next? And what's next? And then I get to the end of the day. I think we had a mandala day. It was a day without depression. It is a life that is happening for me. The book happened for me, the mandalas happened for me, this happened for me, 12-step happened for me, meditation happened for me, writings happened for me, new breath happened for me, new spirit happened for me, blue skies happened for me. There's a sun out there regardless of the clouds, and I'm happening for me. I am a beginner in that first chair that lady talked about. I am brand new because I knew how to do life with depression. I am just learning how to do life with a new spirit. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Sharron. Was there a question back there?
I want to know, what do you journal about? Do you journal about how you feel or what you did wrong?
Whatever comes. I just sit, and whatever thoughts start coming, I start writing. If you're blocked, you can go, I've got this pen in my hand and I'm supposed to be putting some stupid words on this stupid piece of paper and I don't know what to say. You just get starting, and I would let it rip. It just would go. I just write. I am not one, I like that part of the promises where we don't, we don't, something in the past, we don't block out the past, but so if something came up from my past, you don't really have to go back to your past because something today is going to trigger it. And you're going, oh, you look like my mother. Ugh. So I don't go searching and seeking, I just let it come when it comes. Thank you. I no longer regret the past. Or wish to close the door. Well, sometimes I do.
So,
Is the name of your book in the literature?
I doubt. Is the name of the book on the back of that, Jude, the pamphlet? Jude has some of those pamphlets, and Susan has some too. It's called Dancing with Depression. It's not literature approved. I mean, it's not EA approved.
Oh, that's all right. But
I have
does
another
it have?
question too. After you wrote down your thoughts, did you later on try to change them to positive?
No. I never changed anything. I just dumped it. I didn't try to clean up the language. I didn't try to write nicely. I didn't try to spell nicely. I didn't do anything with it. I just got rid of it. What I did do, this was the very first spiritual principle that I learned, and I will tell you, I learned it from the Bhagavad Gita. That's the first book that was brought to me. It's the most excellent synthesis of the psychology and spirituality of man. I learned a lot from that. But the first thing I was to give up was judgment, criticism, and comparison. Judgment, criticism, and comparison. So when you journal, you just get rid of it. And do not look at it as yourself. It's just something in there that needs to go out. And then, so now I find myself transforming from a very, very, very egocentric person, and I hope that I'm moving to a soul-centric person. From egocentric to soul-centric. So basically, if I think it, I know it's not worth the time. If I imagine it, it's not worth the fantasy. Any other questions, comments?
How many years has it been since your last depression?
My last depression was December 3rd of 2010. But I will say this, it was 2 years later I woke up. Do you ever have God wake you up in the morning with the thought? I woke up at 4 a.m. This was the spring of 13, and the thought was, I have delivered you from depression through a 12-step program. And I went, oh my gosh, I only mentioned steps 1, 2, 3, and 11 in my book, but the whole process was 4 through 10. I didn't see it. That's why it's not in the book. I didn't see it. But somebody did. Vince?
What is your feeling about the possibility of return of depression? How do you handle
Oh, thank you. It took us 2 years for me to really verbalize to other. I went back to my doctor after 6 months, and so it's like, always, so how's it going? And I said, well, I don't think I have it anymore. He goes, tell me about that. Psychiatrist, tell me about that. I said, well, my mind might, but I don't think I have it anymore. He goes, okay. So at that time I was on 2 medications, one for the depression and one for the bipolar. He said, okay, well, let's take the one off and come back. So I tapered that off. I went off the other one, tapered that one off. But still I did not claim it. I did not claim it for 2 years until my youngest brother was in ICU. We thought we were losing him to acute leukemia. And I did not go into a depression. I was experiencing feelings, and I would have to call a sister. And I'd say, this is how I'm thinking, this is how I'm feeling. Am I depressed? She said, no, I think you're grieving. I feel the same way. I didn't know what normal was. I didn't know what normal was. Isn't that kind of sad? Anyway, so after that, my brother did survive, but that's when I claimed, and it was in November of 10, 11, 12. And that is also when, anyway, I'm going to get off.